So, welcome back to it's our video two, chapter two with Dr. Avery Neal on her book, If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? So, welcome back, Avery, to discuss chapter two of your book.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So we'll jump right in. And if anyone is seeing this video for the first time, I would recommend you go back to the first video in chapter one because it really does give a lot of context and the reason why Avery wrote the book and talking about subtle abuse. And there's some great information that we're going to expand upon today. So our first question is, relationships naturally include disagreements and compromise. How can someone distinguish between normal conflict and, as you talked about on the last video, being safe in conflict from a recurring pattern of subtle control?
Absolutely. So I'm so glad you asked this because it's really important to explore this question fully because, often in these kinds of relationships, it's confusing. And so it's hard to know, well, isn't this just normal? Or maybe this isn't. When is it not okay? When is it unhealthy? When is it harmful? So this is really important to understand. So we all understand, I think, that relationships have conflict. You have two people with different beliefs, ideas, potentially value systems, experiences that are coming together in a relationship. So, we're going to have some times of conflict or disagreement, and even sometimes and periods in a relationship where, there's less connection and we may feel even more disconnected from our partner than during other phases of the relationship. So that is all really normal and normal conflict and normal a normal pattern seen in a long-term relationship. The thing that's important to recognize is that in a normal relationship, in a healthy relationship, the conflict is it does not escalate to a point where you feel safe, where you feel afraid, where you feel fearful. You're not afraid. You should not feel afraid to speak up. You should not feel afraid of your partner's reaction. That is a big indication that something is wrong in the relationship and there's a power imbalance when you feel that level of fear. And if you do feel that level of fear, there are likely a whole host of other patterns that you've developed in an attempt to sort of keep the peace and manage your partner's reactions. So that's something that's really important. And then the other thing to recognize is that in an unhealthy relationship, that type of conflict is often fraught with criticism, put downs, demeaning messages, things that are designed to tear you down or diminish you, which then creates this power imbalance in the relationship. And so the person that's being torn down feels that they feel smaller, they feel more powerless and helpless, while the other person gains more power and control in the same relationship. And so that is a really important thing to understand in these unhealthy relationships because that power imbalance just becomes greater and greater with time as one person becomes more worn down and the other person continues to gain that power and control. So again, we gain a lot of information when we're able to step back from the relationship and look at it a little bit more objectively to see, is do I feel equal to my partner in this relationship, or is there a power imbalance? Does one person have more control or dominance in the relationship, and do I feel respected and valued? I mean, even in times of conflict, you should know that your partner still loves you, and both people are coming together seeking a resolution in order to restore closeness again. And in an unhealthy relationship, that is not the case. The goal for the controlling partner is to have control in the relationship and to dominate. And so that's the dynamic that we see. And that's how you can tell, okay, what is healthy conflict versus what is an incredibly damaging pattern.
Yeah, and I want to go back to really what you've I want to say created or but really brought out as a big gap in the literature and in the how you work with your patients is this subtle control, and it just seems to me that it's has so much depth, and it's really unfortunately was a gap that was missed, but you really are bringing a lot of attention to how important it is to really recognize, and how probably prevalent it is. And it's your work is really amazing around that, around that domain of being subtle but yet so harmful. Um, so the second question I have is for you is, you describe a push-pull pattern in which hurtful behavior is followed by warmth, affection, or a period of calm. How can a woman tell whether that relationship is generally improving, right? This was, like you talk about, safe, and we disagreed, but closeness is restored, as you say. Is improving, or whether this experience is another part of a same cycle.
This is so important. In a normal, healthy relationship, we can sort of say what we need, or, what we want moving forward. And, our partner may get defensive at first, but ultimately, the desired goal is to have an outcome that's good for both people. In an unhealthy relationship, when we say what we need or we set a boundary, there is a punishment associated with that. And that punishment is designed to dissuade you from speaking up again, or trying to assert your needs again. And so that's really important to pay attention to when we're talking about sort of that push pull pattern. What happens is, you know, our partner may push us away or act in a really hurtful way toward us, and then that's then immediately followed by attempts to restore closeness, like things are okay. Maybe there's an apology, maybe it's a verbal apology, but the pattern kind of continues. And it's important to look at that pattern over time, because when we say what we need, we should be able to see that our partner is trying or attempting to meet our needs. Now, real change is hard. We've got to be patient, but recognizing that we should not feel afraid to voice those needs or to speak up around those needs. That's where, you really have to sort of give it, I think, some time to see, is this just an apology, and are these just sort of meaningless words, or is there really real change and effort behind it? And, we can all be honest, real change is hard. I mean, it takes a lot of work. The first step is really taking responsibility for our behavior and recognizing that our partner doesn't like it, which in these abusive cases often does not occur. There's not accountability, there's not responsibility. It's twisted and turned around to where it's our fault. For real change to occur, the first step is taking responsibility. And then the second piece to that is actually actively working to try to change the pattern that our partner doesn't like or that's hurting our partner. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of conscious effort, and even, takes a certain level of self awareness. So it is not an easy thing. In an abusive relationship, the partner may say, I'll do better, or it won't happen again, especially if it's been a really abusive, overtly abusive episode, such as physical abuse. There may be promises that it will never happen again, but you've got to pay attention to, over time, is that true? Is your partner actively working to get better and to not continue the behavior that you're letting them know is harmful or hurtful?
Kind of on the heels of that question, I think this is really important. So after repeatedly being told that her feelings are wrong or unreasonable, right? So trying to work through this, a woman may stop trusting her own judgment. What can help her begin rebuilding that trust in herself?
Yes, so there are a few things. This is I think we talked in the last episode, this is a long process. It is a journey toward healing, because by the time you've existed in one of these relationships, you're pretty worn down and your confidence is shot. So, one of the first things that I think is really important, kind of like we talked about, sort of taking a step back, being able to look at the dynamic and the patterns more objectively. But then I think what's really critical is that you do start to confide in, the people that you can trust, or that are your support system, if you still have one. There's several reasons for this. One is people, especially people who've known you for a long time and who knew who you were before the relationship and have watched kind of what's happened to you over time, those people may become sort of your biggest support system, and they will recognize kind of that you need extra care and support during this time. But there's also a piece, and we're not going to delve into this probably in too much depth in this episode, but when we're looking at leaving an abusive relationship, you have to evaluate the risk level. With the risk level, it's important that people know what's going on. So, there's safety in numbers. So the more people that sort of have eyes on you and what's going on, actually the safer you are. So that's important too. If you've decided to go ahead and leave the relationship, that's a really important component. So I think not being so alone and reaching out for support and strengthening yourself through your loved ones and through people who really value you and see you, the real you, because you're likely doubting and questioning yourself constantly, and you need that strong feedback of, no, this, I know who you are, and you are good, and you are starting to see what we've been seeing.
Such great advice, because you're moving from isolation into, I love what you talked about. That's a risk level, and people need eyes on you, and you need the strength around you. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's really great. Great advice, Avery. Um, so you identify a lack of empathy as one of the clearest warning signs. What does genuine empathy look like in an everyday relationship, and what should a woman notice when her feelings or needs are repeatedly minimized?
There are two things that are important to know about empathy that we know from the research. One is that empathy and conscience they're directly correlated. They go hand in hand. And so that is very relevant when we're talking about a partnership. And the satisfaction and the care in a partnership. The other thing that we know is that the relationships where there's a higher level of empathy expressed by both partners, those are the relationships that are the happiest. Those are the relationships that thrive over the long haul, and they report the most satisfaction. So empathy is a really important indicator of overall happiness and satisfaction in a partnership long term. When there is an absence of empathy or a very negligible level of empathy, it really wears on the relationship. It makes the other partner feel invalidated, alone, dismissed, misunderstood. When we feel understood, we feel loved, we feel seen, we feel valued. And so when there's that absence of empathy, we feel misunderstood. We feel like we are not heard or our needs don't matter. And so it creates this real emotional separation and division. So that's a really important thing to, I think, recognize in terms of relationship health and relationship dynamics. And then, when we're talking about in the context of abusive relationships, the very reason the person can have the stomach to harm their partner is a lack of empathy. If they had empathy, they would not be able to act out in these, sometimes very vile, horrific ways. That's just a really important thing to acknowledge here, is that the absence of empathy can be quite damaging. And, there's a spectrum of empathy, at just like there's a spectrum and range of abuse. And so, it's important to pay attention to your partner's level of empathy toward you, because the lower their level of empathy, the more likely it is that you're going to experience a greater degree of abuse.
That's very insightful. That's I've never heard that spoken about, but it makes sense. Like the spectrum of empathy, it makes a whole lot of sense in that. Is probably a gauge or a conversation you have with your with your clients. Um, so my next question for you is: once a woman begins recognizing a troubling pattern, what should she pay attention to or document so she can understand more clearly what is happening over time?
There are a number of things that I think are helpful to journal about and to sort of recognize, but I would say, sort of, in terms of urgency and the most pressing things to kind of be paying attention to, it really is sort of, um, in my opinion, the two biggest patterns to pay attention to are, like we were just talking about, the level of empathy, and sort of recognizing, and even writing down if it helps. And I am sort of mixed about if people should write things down. It's very helpful, it's very cathartic, but only if you're safe, and you're not at risk for your partner finding it and harming you in some way if it's found. But when we're looking at a level of empathy, even sort of recognizing, okay, what are the things that my partner does that do make me feel seen, heard, valued, loved? Is there anything in that column? Because in some relationships there really isn't, sadly. And then, what are the things that make me feel diminished and make me feel alone, misunderstood? There's a lack of empathy in the relationship. What is harming me? What is hurting me? So that empathy piece is important to pay attention to. The other big indicator that I think is critical to pay attention to is the level of responsibility in the relationship. So when we're talking about the level of responsibility, yes, we can be talking about sort of who does the chores, but it's way more than that. It's who takes responsibility for the emotional state of the relationship. Are you the one always apologizing, which is common in these kinds of relationships? And are you taking responsibility for the problems in the relationship? And your partner continues to not take responsibility for the problems in the relationship. That's a really important dynamic to be paying attention to, because there should be sort of equal accountability in the relationship, and both people should be working toward making the relationship the best it can be. It should not be sort of lopsided. Um, and same with any kind of child rearing. If you've got it worked out to where there's sort of a divide and conquer thing that works for everybody, that's great. Everybody's comfortable in their roles and responsibilities, that's great. But if one person is taking on, almost all of the responsibility, and even when we're looking at work, and a lot of times in these relationships, the overly responsible person will be, also the one making the living and earning the living and doing everything in the home and with the children and all of this. Meanwhile, the other person is not taking any responsibility or contributing in any meaningful way to the relationship dynamic. And so, these are things that really need to be evaluated and to be looked at objectively.
We'll end with this last question, which I think will be helpful for those listening. When a woman is still unsure about what she's experiencing, who should she talk to, and what makes someone a safe and helpful person to confide in?
It needs to be someone that will support you, and someone that loves you and cares about you and your well-being. And often these are sort of long-term relationships, people who've known us, and maybe have seen sort of what we've gone through in the relationship and kind of what's happened to us over time. A big problem with these relationships is often the isolation factor. So we may have pulled away from our support system, and it may be difficult to reach out to people. So I think really evaluating, are these people going to love me and support me, and they truly want what's in my best interest? Because those are the people that are going to help to strengthen you the most. Sadly, a lot of times people don't understand abusive dynamics. And so, you hear a lot of these sort of uh, cliche phrases, around, it takes two to tango, or both people are at fault, or, these types of things. I mean, I could go on and on about some of the things that just make my stomach turn when I hear them, because they're said by people who very clearly don't understand abusive dynamics. And so what happens is that it creates more shame and doubt and embarrassment on the part of the victim who's actually reaching out for help and support. I would say, really being sort of aware of who are these people that you're looking to seek support from, and do they have the awareness or the understanding of what's been going on to be able to support you in the right way. And also therapists are, I think, an invaluable support system, especially for those who don't have one. You need a space that's safe, that you can turn to, where somebody is going to be there to support you in whatever phase of life you're in, and support you in the ways that you need in order to foster and facilitate your own growth and well-being.
I agree with you about, really having a therapist that's experienced, that understands, the dynamics and can listen objectively, like you talked about earlier. Because you made a good point. Like sometimes even our well-meaning friends or well-meaning long time people that know us might just say something like it takes two to tango, or you're just really not good at relationships, Lisa, or whatever that may be, right? Like, and while it may, it may not be intentional, they just may not, really understand, like you said, those subtle dynamics. So I love that while we do have good people in our lives that know us and can give us be a safe place, I do agree that having a therapist is very, very important, even if you're feeling a little bit not right about something. So thank you for that great advice.
It made me think too that I think it's important to mention a lot of times abusive people are extremely charismatic. And so everybody thinks that, you may be partnered with the most fabulous person ever. And so then that can create, an isolating factor in and of itself. And that's often the case. And so, people may think, well, what are you talking about? Or you're crazy to leave this relationship or whatever, which can really further that sense of isolation and shame. So, and fear and worry about ending the relationship, knowing that you are going to face criticism and judgment. That is often the case. That's why it is so important to have even one or two people who are really supportive of you and understand what's actually happening that you can trust to help you through that whole phase of ending the relationship. So sorry, I just thought of that and I thought it's important to share.
That was really great. I think that's a really important aspect because, like you said, sometimes our well-meaning friends or just people in general might not see everything. They see one side, like someone who's charismatic. It's a great, great point. Um, so, for those listening and who want to learn more about Avery's work, her book, "If He's So Great, Why Do We Feel So Bad," is on Amazon. It's on Audible. It's an ebook. And also psychologicalabuse.com, where she has a three-series course on this process. And I'll let Avery share a little bit about the three courses, if you don't mind, just for a moment for the audience.
Absolutely. So I tried to break it up into sort of the phases of treatment and recognition and then kind of reclaiming your identity and then healing the nervous system. So it's really designed as if someone were walking through the therapeutic process with me in terms of start to finish how to heal from how to recognize this kind of behavior and relationship and then how to fully heal from it. So it kind of goes in sequential order in the way that is most helpful.
So that's psychologicalabuse.com. Thank you, Avery.
Likewise.